We will hear first from Representative Kapenga, the author of AJR 81, and welcome, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee members, for being here and listening to the testimony on AJR 81. And I will just make a quick comment on, we're hearing this resolution. You typically don't hear have public hearings on resolutions, but we're kind of adding this on because AB 635 is going to be heard also, and this relates to that. So we just figured, hey, I kind of wanted to have a public hearing because this is a little bit out of the norm for a resolution. Wanted to make sure the public had input on it, and then we're going to have AB 635 come, which is really the elections bill. So with that, I will start. Over the past decade, the issue of our national debt has constantly been in the spotlight, and debt levels have skyrocketed to nearly 17 trillion. And for those of you who don't know, that's 12 zeros, and that's a lot of zeros. This equates to approximately $146,000 of debt per household. So with a median family income of roughly $53,000 in the U.S., if these families were required to list this debt on their personal financial statement, most would qualify for bankruptcy. Our debt is being paid for in two ways. First, we are printing more than 75% of the debt, which means money is being created out of thin air. And as many economists are saying, we are putting ourselves at risk of hyperinflation. Second, foreign countries are purchasing our bonds that may not have our best interest in mind. The old proverb, the borrower is slave to the lender, should no doubt raise some concern here. We're hearing warning signs coming from all directions on the significant consequences coming, yet Washington takes no action. Even President Obama's National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform made the following plea to no avail. Over the course, and this is the quote, over the course of our deliberations, the urgency of our mission has become all the more apparent. The contagion of debt that began in Greece and continues to sweep through Europe shows us clearly that no economy will be immune. If the U.S. does not put its house in order, the reckoning will be sure and the devastation severe. After all the talk about debt and deficits, it is long past time for America's leaders to put up or shut up. And keep in mind, this is a direct quote. This is not Representative Kapenga. The era of debt denial is over, and there can be no turning back. The problem is real, and the solution will be painful. We must stabilize and then reduce the national debt, or we could spend $1 trillion, again, that's 12 zeros, a year in interest alone by 2020. There is no easy way out of our debt problem, so everything must be on the table. A sensible, realistic plan requires shared sacrifice, and Washington must lead the way and tighten its belt. Now, both Republican and Democrat administrations are responsible for our debt crisis. This is not a political party thing. For the first time in our nation's history, our children will need to pay for the sins and the irresponsible behavior of the parents. For the first time in history, this has never happened before. Even the most fiscally conservative budgets being proposed at the federal level take over a decade just to balance the annual deficit. And that's really important because a lot of people hear, oh, we're going to balance in 10 years, and they think it's debt. That is the annual deficit. So that means for another decade, we are going to continue to pile on to our debt load. It's important to highlight that the vast majority of voters support a balanced federal budget. In 2010, Florida put this on a referendum, and 72% of the public on that referendum were in favor of a federal balanced budget. And they actually had the verbiage in that referendum said, and does not include a tax increase, which is interesting. The Florida legislature subsequently passed the resolution on a bipartisan basis. A national public poll in 2011 indicated 74% of the public in favor, and again in 2013, 85% of the public is in favor of a federal balanced budget. Last month, the Ohio legislature passed this similar resolution with strong bipartisan support, making nearly 20 states who have an active resolution. Michigan, Tennessee, and Virginia are also working through the process right now. Our founding fathers repeatedly warned us against debt because they realized it was a key driver to the decline of every major civilization. This again confirms that the actions at the federal level are putting at risk the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that Jefferson put in the Declaration of Independence. In light of this problem, it's time for the Wisconsin State Legislature to once again utilize their federal powers as authorized under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. We must require the federal government to operate under a balanced budget. The amendment process, as defined in Article 5 of the Constitution, reads as follows, and this is the verbiage that gives us the authorization. The Congress, whenever two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislature of two-thirds of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states, or by conventions in three-fourths thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. I will skip the rest of it. It is important to first understand why the founders worded the article the way they did, and second, we'll look at what controls they put in place to ensure the document remains the will of the people, the document meaning the Constitution. The founders included the state amendment option in Article 5 to ensure a balance of power exists between the federal and state governments. This system of checks and balances under our federalist system, which is a balance, is what ensures the government derives its consent or approval from the will of the people instead of the other way around. History shows that the tendency is for power to slowly centralize to the national government until such time as that government becomes so powerful that the people no longer control it. Rather, it controls them. George Mason provided good insight into this during the debate of this article when he stated, "It would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse their consent on that very account." The article was adopted on a unanimous vote at the convention in 1787. Next, the founders put significant controls in place to ensure that any changes made to the original document remain the will of the people it protects. Please refer to Appendix A. And what I want to do at this point is Appendix A is a PowerPoint that I typically use as I walk through the controls. It's a lot easier than taking that block of words and trying to explain it. So if you look at Appendix A, which is a color printout, I tried to do it double-sided to save paper and ink, but it didn't work out. So I apologize for my non-green handout here. So Appendix A talks about the Article 5 controls that are in the Constitution. And note, this is after the 34 applications have to come into Congress, which would actually call a convention. So the first control that we have in Article 5 is the majority of state delegations. So the majority of a delegation, each state sends a delegation, which is what actually AB 635 talks about. We'll get into that next. The historical precedent is one state, one vote. Therefore, a majority of the delegates from a state must agree to any action in order for that state to vote affirmative. So we start out with the state delegation, and you'll see the Wisconsin state delegation language. We're proposing 5 delegates. So in this, you would have to have 3 of the 5 delegates approve any amendment language or any action for the Wisconsin state delegation. Okay, so that's control number 1. You've got your state delegations. Then flip to the next page. And what I did is I put the controls around each other so you can see they continue to build around the previous control. So control 2 is the majority of state delegations. So every state has their delegation, and each state will define what their own delegation is going to be. We don't know what that will be. But each state has a delegation, and we will need at least a majority of of the state delegations to approve the amendment language. So that means at least 26 state delegations, which is a simple majority. This has not been defined yet, so I expect it would probably be a higher requirement because you've got 34 or the 2/3 to make the call, or you've got 75% or 38. So you've got 3 different options that could be chosen by the convention as your ratification number. Okay, so at least 26%, a simple majority of the state delegations have to be there. So that's the second control that's in place. So let's go to the next control that surrounds that. If that happens, at least 75% of the states have to approve or ratify what comes down from the convention. And this is important because there's two different options that Congress can choose. They can either choose the state legislatures to ratify, which 27 of the 28 amendments, that's the process they used. They did use one time, they chose the second option, which is actually a state convention. Our assumption is the state legislatures would most likely be chosen. That's how we built the control. It may be the state convention. We don't know. So this model builds a control around the first two of a majority of state legislatures. Now, in each state legislature outside of Nebraska, which is unicameral, the only one in the U.S., there's two houses, the House or Assembly and the Senate. So that means it's not just 38 states. It's actually going to be 75 or 76 independent legislative bodies, which puts another significant control around any amendment that could get through. And Patrick Henry, if you read the Federalist Papers and the history behind this, when he saw this, he kind of threw up his hands and he's like, this will never, ever get an amendment through it with the controls you have in place. But the founders were comfortable with it. At the end of the day, again, it was a unanimous vote. Okay, and then I added a fourth control because a lot of people had talked about the Articles of Confederation. There was a control, this is a control that was not in place when the Articles of Confederation and the original Philadelphia Convention happened. And that is, we now have a federal government that has a Supreme Court that could or could not step in. I put a dotted line around it because we don't know what they would do. They've heard some Article 5 cases before, and they, under the political question doctrine, said, we're not touching it. But if you read through the recent opinions by the court, you see a lot of references to state powers. We saw it with DOMA, we saw it with Kapenga. Those decisions, if you read them, they're really pushing and relying heavily on state powers. So we added that control in place. So that's the process or controls that the founders put in place, which you can see there is a significant amount of process that has to take place and happen in order for an amendment to actually be ratified and put into our Constitution. Okay, so back to my testimony sheet. In addition to what the founders put in place for controls, let me quick find my place here. Okay, in addition to the controls the founders put in place, we are putting safeguards in place at the state level, and this is AB 635 that we'll be hearing in a little bit. This bill specifies how our delegates to an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments would be selected, and it puts controls in place that ensure integrity and transparency once they're at that convention, so that they are acting within the call that we authorize them as the state legislature. In summary, Thomas Jefferson highlights in the Declaration of Independence the care with which we should approach changing our Constitution, and at the same time points out the human tendency to accept suffering over change. And he specifically states, prudence indeed will dictate that government long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Due to the clear and present danger of the national debt, the direct, real, and disastrous consequences of our current course, and the directive from the public, it's our duty as state legislators to act, and to act timely. We cannot pretend, as other civilizations have done throughout history, to be immune from the ubiquitous laws of nature. That would be foolish and liken us to a person who stands in front of a moving freight train with the thought that they can stop it simply because they have the will. An unfortunate reality will, without any doubt, bring that delusion to an unfortunate end. There is no question that state legislators hold a deep-seated revere for our Constitution. All have taken an oath to uphold it. We must therefore, in a thoughtful, prudent, and measured manner, carry out the rights and responsibilities given us by the Founding Fathers in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution by instituting a balanced budget amendment. Thank you again, Chairman Bernier and members, and at this time I will take questions.
Thank you, Representative. Are there any questions for Representative Kapenga?
We're going to go, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, we're going to go straight into this bill, though.
Is it just on the amendment or on the bill?
I think we'll stick with the amendment, and we'll take up the bill after we talk about the resolution.
Okay.
Okay? Okay. No questions on the resolution itself?
It'd be nice
Or-
to talk about it all.
Can we do both just simultaneously?
Okay,
Because I think some of my questions might actually
Yeah.
have to
Sure.
do with the entirety of.
all right. Do you have a separate presentation?
Yeah, well, we just have separate testimony, so we'll hand that out real quick so we can just.
Well, then we may as well,
It's already been handed out.
No, we
Let
have
him-
the testimony.
It's already been handed out.
We have the,
he just wanted it for his own use. Representative, if it's okay with you, we're going to discuss the resolution and the bill simultaneously. Does that work for you?
Chairwoman, whatever is your desire.
Okay, so you go ahead with your presentation on AB 635,
Yes,
and then we'll take questions from everyone in regard to that. Okay, thank you.
great. Thank you, Chairwoman Bernier and committee members for holding this hearing today on AB 635. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides state legislatures the authority to propose amendments to that Constitution. In light of the issues we are seeing at the federal level, there has been a resurgence of state Article 5 resolution activity, including one in our great state, to hold a convention for proposing amendments. This bill ensures that if such a convention for proposing amendments were called, the legislature has prudent procedures in place to determine, number one, to determine how the delegates to such a convention are to be selected, and number two, to ensure integrity and transparency in the action of those delegates. Delegates are to be selected from the legislature in the following manner in this bill: 2 representatives appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly, 2 senators appointed by the President of the Senate, and then 1 member appointed by the governor from the body of his or her choosing. Additionally, a delegate recall process is defined on how to recall the authority of a delegate who takes action while at the convention on subject matter outside of the call. Finally, a joint committee of correspondence is to be created by the legislature after a call by Congress for an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments. This committee will be the communication channel with the delegates as well as the control mechanism to ensure that they are comfortable with the rules that actually come from the legislative body, that convention of the states. Thank you for your attention, and I am happy to answer questions on either the resolution or the bill.
Thank you. Now we're ready for questions. Representative Weininger first, and then we'll follow by Representative Kessler.
Actually, if I could defer to Representative Kessler for right now.
Okay, Representative
I'm
Kessler.
happy to defer to Representative Weininger.
No, I'm still making questions.
Okay.
I have like
All right.
5 or 6.
Starting out, my major concern is knowing and having read about the Federal Constitutional Convention that wrote our Constitution. I can't recollect anything in there that impaired upon the individual judgment of those who were selected and participated. In fact, we had some of the most brilliant people of our time who exercised independent judgment. What I am seeing here is the independent judgment is totally taken away. That you have to, if you decide you're going to, hear some additional facts, find out some additional facts, and you decide that there has to be some changes made, you're going to be recalled. That troubles me enormously, that you're taking away the independent judgment of the persons who were selected. I'm also troubled a little bit by why aren't we instead, for instance, directly electing the delegates to the Constitutional Convention? why are they being selected by the state legislature instead of by the people? What are you afraid of to have the people make that selection? I guess starting out with those two questions.
Sure.
I may have more, I don't know,
Sure.
but at least this point, let me hear your response.
Sure, okay. First off, let's just start out with the independent judgment of people selected. So once a delegate is selected, they would go to the convention would convene, and the delegates are allowed to discuss and debate anything that the legislature has sent them there to do. So in this instance, if a balanced budget amendment or a balanced budget discussion came, they could talk about the subjects. There's no restrictions there. Hey, let's figure out a solution on how we're going to do this.
So they could talk about, let's amend the Fourth Amendment
They
or
could.
the First Amendment?
Sure. No, great question. And this comes up a lot. Well, what happens if they come and say we're going to take the First Amendment or the Second Amendment away? If they did that under the bill, the other delegates have the ability to say, that's outside of what we were sent here for.
So the independent judgment is impaired right there.
Not if it's within the authorization that they were sent for. If it's outside of what the legislature authorized them to go for, absolutely.
That was
Because-
not a provision in the first Constitution.
No, but that was the Constitutional Convention.
That's correct.
Okay, they were very clear in their language, and if you read the debates about Article 5, they're very clear that, no, we're not going to have a second Constitutional Convention. The wording was discussed, and they said we are going to have a convention for proposing amendments because the Founding Fathers did not want to rewrite the Constitution.
But
So
if they
there is,
proposed an amendment on the Fourth Amendment, isn't that within their purview?
if there is a call, they are limited to the call. Because they are not, the intent and the spirit of Article 5 is not to rewrite the Constitution. And if the state legislature is the authorizing body, which under the 10th Amendment, the feds don't have any control, the state legislatures are in control of the Article 5 process. And we as a legislature have to define what we think it's going to be. Representative, if you feel that the delegates can go and talk about anything, then you would have to propose an amendment to this bill because I'm not comfortable with that.
Okay,
I-
let's assume that I even decide, can I continue this, Madam Chair? I don't want to.
Within limits, yes, go ahead.
Okay, let's assume I decide, okay, I'll go along with a balanced budget amendment. But we're going to balance this budget by increasing the taxes on the upper bracket. Is that within the call?
That discussion was in the call. Absolutely.
So
So
we're not limited to sitting there and saying, reduce government. That convention could also increase the authority of the Constitution to mandate a higher tax on the 1% who are getting away with murder right now.
The call is to determine how we're going to balance the budget. And we are not going to get, nor are we authorized in step one by the Founding Fathers to talk about, let's lay out what the resolution language says. If you look at the history of Article 5, anytime we step into that realm in step one, it causes a lot of legal problems. So we are not talking about what that's going to be. That is the responsibility of the delegates once a convention for proposing amendments is called. And that's very important. So if they come through and they say, you know what, we're going to balance this budget by cutting 50% and by increasing taxes by 50%, that is within their ability. And let's say that the convention goes along with it and says, great.
What if
Let's
they say, we're going to balance this budget by cutting the military by 50%?
again, Representative, what you're doing is you're putting the cart in front of the horse here.
No.
And I'm not going to get into a debate on what the amendment says because that's not my responsibility. That's the responsibility of the delegates once they're there. But if they want to talk about that, absolutely. And if the convention, simple majority or 34 or 38, whatever they determine, says, yes, we agree with that, then it has to go to the state legislatures or the states
I understand that.
and be voted through. But they absolutely can talk through that discussion, and that's within the purview of the call. So that would be my response to your first question.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, on to your second question.
Second question, direct election of delegates. The Article 5 process that was laid out is clear that the state legislatures are, it's either going to be Congress or the state legislatures that are in charge of the amendment process. So in this instance, we're taking option 2. The state legislatures are running the process of the amendments. When we looked at it, there is a significant amount of accountability for me because I represent 53,000 people. Okay? And I think that we as elected officials may carry a little bit more, and I want to be careful with how I say this because I mean no disrespect to the patriots out there who would step in and do it. But we have a lot more accountability because we've got that 53,000 people we're representing behind us when we go out there. And I thought this, as you look at the process, I am more comfortable with that added accountability going in. And again, the Founding Fathers gave this process definition to the state legislatures.
But the state legislature can mandate instead a direct election for the delegates.
We could if we wanted to, absolutely.
And wouldn't that be much more representative of
But
the
what-
population as a whole?
Representative, we represent the people. And the
But-
Founding
but-
Fathers understand that
But
we
you're
are here to represent the people. We're not.
But you represent them in a gerrymandered system.
Representative Kessler, I didn't reiterate this at the beginning of the meeting, which I
Okay.
usually do in a committee, that you're not here to argue with those testifying, you're here to ask questions.
Do you not represent them in a gerrymandered system?
I will not respond to that. If that's your opinion, Representative, you are welcome to that.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Representative Weininger.
Actually, I have a number of questions. Some of them are a little bit more just for informational. I've been receiving a number of emails. I shouldn't say emails, some calls from my office. So I just kind of want to talk through some of them. One is actually what Representative Kessler was talking about, but it's actually kind of on the other end of it. The concern is more of on the possibility of a runaway convention, where you would have people that would do kind of what Representative Kessler would talk about, going beyond the scope of saying, Congress, you didn't do your job, you need to balance your budget. What are the safeguards, again, that you have in place to ensure that things like that don't happen, so you don't have folks like Representative Kessler, example of cutting the military by 50%, by going after, I'll say, the middle class with a 2% tax increase?
Was going to be higher.
Thank you for adding levity to this situation.
Sorry, but could you, I would like to, I've done research on this, but I'd like you to respond to that.
Yeah.
For those
Well,
folks.
I will just start with, I started this research about 2 years ago, and I walked into this. I didn't have any experience with Article 5, but I had a constituent come to me and say, hey, can you tell me a little bit about this? Here's the concerns I've got. I know there's some movements out there. So I spent the last 2 years, and I've got 2 folders about that thick of just research. So I didn't have any, intent to run an Article 5 or not to run an Article 5. And I kept running across this concern that the convention would run away. And as I studied it, number one, if you look at the reason Article 5 was put in place, I already explained part of it with, hey, this is not a constitutional convention. That happened in 1787. The founders were very clear with their language. It's a convention for proposing amendments. So we don't have carte blanche in this thing. So let's just start there. So if it would ever go to a court challenge of something, I think you've got some precedent there and some backup. The other thing is we've got a delegate limitation or a delegate act that we're putting in place for responsibility and accountability to the legislature. And an interesting thing is, as I was walking through this process, there's kind of an underlying element to that thought process, and that is that everybody who's serving in public office has no integrity. because you would have to have a significant number of people who have taken an oath to the Constitution, potentially taken an oath and been given a responsibility from their legislature to go to this, say, we're going to throw out everything that we have taken an oath to. We're going to throw out the responsibility we've been given by our legislature to this historical event and ignore it. And I have, there's a lot of ethical cases that take place within the legislatures throughout the states, but we've got 1,700 and some legislators. If you go back through all the years, I don't think it's a majority of state legislators who lack that integrity. I think it's a very small percentage of people who have actually had issues come up. So if you look at the reality of the situation, you can say Santa Claus is real too. Well, some people believe that, but you know what? There's the reality to it. I hope my daughters aren't listening because they're crying right now. Santa Claus isn't real. But that's just an example of that. I think you have to look at the controls I walked through. Let's just take what the Founding Fathers put in place. And as you add layer upon layer upon layer of controls, these guys, as Representative Kessler brought up, they're brilliant. These guys are brilliant. They knew, and they said, let's put the controls in place to make sure that this country is not put at risk. So just go to that, and let's just take the last one. 75% of the states have to ratify anything that comes out.
Okay, and Madam Chair, if I just have
You can follow up, sure.
Thank you very much. The other concern I heard was, you laid out a really good argument and why this needs to be done. I mean, the debt load on our average families would put someone in bankruptcy. Well, why not just work through the regular process? I mean, these are our representatives. If there's such a great concern, why don't people just throw them out?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just say history is the best predictor of the future.
Okay.
That's a very easy
Sure.
answer.
And since they don't listen anyway, if there were something that were to pass, and they basically said, no, we don't want to uphold the Constitution, would that just go to this, would someone file a court case with the Supreme Court to have them ejected, or how would that work?
Are you saying if we put a...
Well, let's say it goes through the process,
Yep.
and at the end of the day, the states ratify it, and this is in place, and now it's a constitutional amendment. The Congress, for some reason, they're unable to balance their budget, which they haven't for a while. They don't do it. They leave to go back home. As an ordinary citizen, what recourse do I have? Would I have to file something with the Supreme Court for an enforcement action? Would they, be forced to lose their seats in a new election? What?
Sure. And I am not an attorney, but if they do not follow what we set in place in the Constitution, that's when we would bring the court system in.
Madam Chair.
That's one option we have.
Okay.
Obviously, the ballot box is a pretty significant one if they're not following the orders that they've been given.
Okay. I do have a few minutes more questions, but I'll yield.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay. You want me to put you back on after we go through?
Is there
the-
just one more person?
No, two.
Oh, yeah, I'll be good by then.
Yeah. So what do you think? Representative Craig, you are up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Representative, for doing all the work on this. I think this is a very unique issue, not only in the originality of the situation that we find ourselves in, both in the problem that we have in Washington, D.C. right now, from a budgetary standpoint, but the originality in uncharted waters that you have tread and put the work into, both historical research and constitutional research. So thank you for doing that. A couple of questions, I think, in response to my friend from Milwaukee. Do we live in a direct democracy, or do we live in a republic?
I thought of that after we went to the next question. This is a republic.
This is a republic.
That's right.
We elect elected officials like ourselves to represent our 53,000 constituents. Our governor to represent the millions of people that live in this state. And for the many high offices that we have in our state government, the government appoints, the Senate confirms. That is the role that we really exercise, at least on the south side of the building. The legislature's role in confirming high officials within our state government. So I don't believe that this is in any way some type of original process. And I think if my friend from Milwaukee would read a book from hundreds of years ago called Plato's book, The Republic, he may see that there are reasons that we have republic in place for expediency in government, for efficient representation, for progress, to take a word out of that side of the aisle, but to make sure that we do have efficient government that can get things done in an expedient manner. I think what this really comes down to, why we're going through this extraordinary process, and again, I salute you for that, is the magnitude of the problem. And I got your testimony just now, and I had already worked out the numbers on the national debt, and our numbers do line up. That is the debt that has accrued so far, $17 trillion. And if you take our obligations that our federal government has accumulated based on current policy right now, estimates go anywhere from a baseline of $60 trillion going forward up to $200 trillion, depending on which Ivy League economist you talk to. So if you start out from the baseline that our children, my 5 children, your 2 children, the children here of Wisconsin that are represented by their parents, grandparents, we are talking somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 for every man, woman, and child that we have in our country. So I think when it comes down to why are we going through this extraordinary process, and I would imagine some people on the other side of the aisle, maybe some people in this room, maybe even some people on our own side of the aisle, wonder why we're going through the extraordinary process that we're going through. It's because we are truly and sincerely concerned about the dire financial situation that our country finds itself in. So I don't really have a question in there anywhere for you.
Well,
I'm saluting your good work. And I did ask you your question about the Republican and
You did.
representative democracy. But I just want to say to you, thank you for doing the work that you've done.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I would encourage our members on the panel to support that.
And I appreciate your comments, and you know, most of you know me, I'm a CPA, so I'm a big numbers guy. I love numbers, and I'll tell you, if I could lay in my testimony all the numbers I looked at, you'd all be sleeping. I guarantee it. But they're so exciting to me, but yet so depressing. Because when you look at it right now, the interest that we're paying on our debt in the U.S. is more than all of the corporate income taxes that are collected. Every corporation out there, we take their money and we use it to pay the interest on the debt. Okay, that's not healthy for a country. And what's going to happen when interest rates go up? And I need to hold myself back on the numbers, but let's just put it this way. Interest rates will go up, and the interest rate payments will skyrocket. Where's it going to come from? Numbers don't lie. That's what I love about numbers in accounting. They force you to look at every reality. And do you know what? It's going to come from somewhere. And at some point, we're not going to have enough. And you know what happens if the federal government defaults on its debt? What would happen? You want to talk about chaos? Look what happened in Europe. Multiply that by 10 because we lead the world financial markets. We lead them. Most of our retirements, especially representative, is in the markets. They will tank. And I could go on and on. But the reality is the numbers don't lie. You cannot look away from where this is going. It scares me to death. And again, if we don't do it, guys, the federal government is not doing anything. Their proposals do nothing to fix the problem. And they're not going to because you know what? We have some good people there. But it's the system, it's the monster that runs things in Washington. And if you go to Washington, it is unbelievable the size and the scope of that city. And the building after building after building and the millions of employees that exist, it is unbelievable. And it blows me away every time, especially this last time in December I was there. And it was erector crane after erector crane after erector crane of buildings going up, and it just continues to grow. And we as states have to step up and say, you know what? We have to make some tough decisions because Washington is not going to do it. Doesn't matter what party. They're both responsible, and they're not stepping up.
Thank you. That was a good answer to Representative
Good question.
Craig's question. Representative Kessler.
I'm going to defer to my good friend Representative Berceau, who was suggesting things to me, and I said I'd rather have
Do
her
it yourself.
take the lead on this.
Okay, we will defer. Representative Berceau.
Well, I always like to see Representative Kessler and Representative Craig discuss the Constitution and other issues, both being very knowledgeable. My question, I commend you for doing all the research that you did, and on the federal level, we have a $725 million structural deficit in Wisconsin. We have a $750 million deficit going into the next budget cycle. We have $15 billion in long-term debt, and we owe the federal government $1 billion that we borrowed. Wouldn't you say the place to start might be our own backyard? And I'm not saying that this isn't an accumulation of years, potentially, but wouldn't cleaning up our own backyard be a good exercise first?
It's a little
Our
bit
own
outside
house,
of the
rather?
scope of what we're talking about, but I will just answer with this. We, as the state of Wisconsin, have a constitutional limit on the debt that we can incur, along with 48 other states. Okay, so this is not foreign. There's 49 states that actually have in their constitution some type of thing that limits them, and that's for safety. We're not close to the debt limit. I don't like our debt representative, and that may be something we both agree on. And I would love to sit down with you after this and figure out a solution on how to get that down. That'd be great. But the reality is we have a debt limit. We're not close to it. And let me just throw out another number because I'm a numbers guy. Let's look at what we make in the state to what we owe in the state. Okay, because that's a measurement. It's called debt to GDP or debt to, I'll just keep it there. We're at about 5.6%. Our debt, what we owe to what we make. Debt to GDP. The United States of America, federal government, is at 108%. Okay? 108% of what they owe to what we make. So there is a huge, huge disparity there. Again, the numbers scare me to death. And I will sit with you and we'll work on a debt solution for Wisconsin. But in the meantime, we can't sit back and say, well, let's focus on this issue and ignore what's going on in Washington.
And do you think that the governor's proposal to return money at a time when we have debt is a good proposal?
Representative, Madam Chair.
Yes, can we stay on the subject matter? And I think that Representative Kapenga would be happy to meet with you and talk about the fiscal condition. But I think the comparative, Representative Berceau, was excellent. It brought it down to more, a lower level where most of us can wrap our mind around, because we see the numbers at the state level quite a bit. But I think his point, he answered you, and I think the comparison was helpful. But let's stay on to what we're talking about today, and that is the Constitutional Amendment Convention agenda. So with that, we are going to move back to Representative Weiner for his follow-up questions.
Today's been very, very long, and there's a lot of folks that want to testify on this. So I'd like to thank them for their patience and defer my questions, because these folks have been sitting here since noon, so.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Representative Zamaripa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Kapenga, for your testimony. You certainly had me doing my homework on this one. And while I agree, I acknowledge that, of course, deficit reduction is necessary. As I looked and did my research, I'm hearing economists say time after time that forcing the federal government to take up this balanced budget amendment is not the correct vehicle, because states have to balance their budget every year. It makes it more important than ever, from the research that I did, that the federal government not also face this requirement. It could potentially further impair a faltering economy. This is what I discovered from my research, Representative, and this is why I have great concern, and I'm wondering why this vehicle has come forth. I know you said that you had a constituent bring it up to you. As I hear you give the talking points and I hear your colleagues backing you up, I feel like, is this just a vehicle to criticize President Obama? When you look at every state having a balanced budget, forcing the federal government to have a balanced budget, what would that mean if we were to face a potential military conflict? Or in 2008, when President Bush was still in office, with the bailout, we wouldn't have been able to do that. If I'm not mistaken, when I did my research, that if we had that issue upon us again in our country, that wouldn't be possible if this was forced on our federal government.
Sure. There's a couple of questions in there, and I will first address this being the correct vehicle, and that is, I don't know what economists you look at, and I don't know what vehicle they used to balance the budget. But there is not a defined vehicle yet for that. I will just say that. That is what the delegates will talk through. And we know that it's not going to be something where you all of a sudden say, day one, when we walk out and the states adopt the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, we all know that we have to deal with the reality. And the reality is, we can't just say, we're going to raise taxes and cut spending so that year two, we are balancing our revenues with our expenses. That's just not a reality. That's why you're seeing things like the 10-year deficit reduction plan. That part of it, again, Representative Kessler was kind of getting into that. What is it going to be? We don't have that defined yet. We know this, and this kind of plays into your partisan question. Number one, I've been very careful not to be partisan in any way. Very clear, this is a federal state issue, because the Democrats and the Republicans are both at fault. There have been irresponsible decisions. There has not been leadership, and we could talk about that for a long time. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. Think about it this way. We have to have 75% of the state legislatures adopt whatever would come out for a balanced budget amendment. Do you think that California would just let Texas draft it and say, yep, we got it. We'll take whatever you put out of there? Absolutely not. We're going to have Democrat-controlled states and Republican-controlled states work together to find a solution. But the alternative is not acceptable, because we just walked through the problems we are facing right now. And not doing anything, think through what would happen or what will happen once we get to a point where we cannot pay our debt. Because we can't raise taxes enough. It doesn't matter. We could there's statistics all over the place of how much we would have to take to tax. And we're not going to be able to cut our way out of this in 2 years. There's going to have to be an approach that both parties agree on to resolve the issue. But sitting back and saying, well, I've heard an economist, or this person is telling me that it's not a good idea. If you come up with a better solution, I am all ears. But for 2 years, I've spent looking for one, and I don't see a way out of it. I don't. But again, if you have an option that will work better, please let me know, because we've got to work together to solve this problem.
Follow-up?
Yeah, yes, please, thank you, Madam Chair. So, some of the research that I did, I see that when the economy crashed back in 2008, when President Bush was still in office, if this were in place, your proposal, if you were able to force the federal government, pass this balanced budget amendment at the federal level, Congress would have been unable to respond with a stimulus package or efforts to stabilize banks and auto manufacturers.
Okay.
If this were in place, if you
Yep.
were able to make this reality.
Well,
way
no,
back
no, okay,
then.
we have to be careful again, because what you're doing is you're stepping into step two, and you're saying, I'm assuming that you're going to put a balanced budget amendment in place that will say, you're going to balance year two, no matter what. If you look at most of the proposals out there, they make exceptions for specific situations, like if there's a situation of war, we need to be able to provide for the national defense for a war or something like that. There are exceptions that are in the proposals, and I guarantee they would be in any amendment that would be drafted. Because the reality is, we can't just say our revenues are going to match our expenses every single year. That's just not a reality. It doesn't exist in the real world. So we would definitely address your concerns, or the delegates, when they're there, would address those concerns in whatever the solution drafted is. But again, I will go back to what President Obama's team said. The problem is real. The solution will be painful. We must stabilize and then reduce the national debt, or we could spend $1 trillion a year in interest alone. There's no easy way out of our debt problem, so everything must be on the table. I completely agree with him.
I think it's like you said earlier then, are we putting the cart before the horse? Because I hear you saying, we are, Representative, going to put something in there to make sure if we're facing some military conflict or another instance where our economy is crashing, we'll make sure we have language in place. But it's just, you're telling me that, but you can't.
Sure.
You can't tell the future. I just think that I almost feel like we're signing our souls over here. We just don't even know what we're going to get. You can't tell me factual.
If we don't pass this right here, nothing will happen. We will not be part of a solution. So I can guarantee you that. If we put this in place and we put the responsible limitations in, something will happen and we will move forward to protect this country and the citizens that live in it. But if we don't follow the responsibility the Founding Fathers gave us as state legislators in the Constitution, we're all lost. And that's no solution at all. I'm not willing to sit back and say, I'm okay with that. That's why me and you have to work together, and we're going to have to. Again, 75% of the states have to say, we're good with this plan. It's going to suck, but we're good with it because we know there's no other way around it.
I respectfully disagree with you, Representative Kapenga. I don't think there's any assurance that if the economy crashes and you forced a mandate on the federal government and now they can't do anything to help out its constituents, then we're going to flail.
And I respect that, but I would just defer to the public who brought us here, overwhelmingly say, this has got to be done.
Okay, moving on. Representative Kessler, I believe you're back again.
Well, just there was a little bit of a concern. I believe our Constitution does place a limit on the debt Wisconsin has. I think it's like 100,000, or I can't quote it.
Based on our assets in the state, it's about $22 billion.
No, based on our Constitution.
Right, our Constitution has in it
Yes. It has a dollar
that
amount.
comes out to about $22 billion.
it has a
It's
dollar
a percent of assets.
There's a dollar amount. Maybe I'm going to have to get my blue book out and get the Constitution out, and I don't have it with me. But all these years, I've always been under we've then turned around, and we have created these corporations that, quote, are really not part of us, that take the debt. So we have a $725 million debt. And it just seems to me that if we're going to go and talk about balanced budgets, we ought to be addressing ourselves first before we try to correct what the federal government has. Wisconsin could correct itself, but it hasn't. And I agree with you. It's been both parties that have used those devices and created these fictions to do that. But I think that has to be addressed too. And I can't think of a better time And when we have a surplus like we have right now, and instead of returning it,
Okay, we are off the subject
I understand.
matter again.
I understand that, but I think
AB
I'm the only one.
635
I would be happy
is
to
what
work
we're
with you, Representative.
discussing.
That's when she cut me off, too.
I don't think I was the first and only one off the subject.
No, you weren't. You were the second one.
I always give you a little latitude, but then when it goes,
Hits too close to home.
oh, no.
Madam Chair.
Representative
there-
Burso,
there's
I
a lot of
like you.
folks-
Don't be nasty.
There's a lot of
I
folks
said it
waiting
with
to
a smile.
testify.
Excuse me?
There's a lot of folks waiting to testify.
I know, that's why we need to move along, and as long as my colleagues here are finished, I will reserve, I have a question or two myself, but I think I'll wait for a bit.
I would
think
be
we
happy to
have-
come back up afterwards to make sure these people are heard.
Oh,
If you want me to, I'll be around.
okay, thank you, Chris.